So Jerry, over to you.
Great, let me turn the screen on. Good evening, everybody. Thank you for inviting me to this talk. Actually, what we're trying to accomplish in the next 45 minutes to an hour is a yeoman's task. And one of the reasons that it is because we're trying to put together a 3,000-year history of the Jewish people, together with occupations of this piece of real estate over roughly about 1,700 years, to the present situation, how we got there, how this connects to the brain, and how we can get a fundamental understanding of why we're actually in trouble and how we got to this particular point. So let me start with an anecdote. One of my doctoral students, a pretty well-known guy who will go nameless, mature gentleman, he's roughly about 60, if that's a good definition of maturity. I had asked him once upon a time, where are you from? What are you? He's American, American-born. And he said he's Italian. And I told him, actually, no, you're not. And he told me, what are you talking about? Of course I'm Italian. I said, no, you can't be Italian, because even though your parents were born in Italy, in 1861, Vittorio Emanuele II, the then king of Sardinia, was the fellow who actually was able to organize the Italian city-states for the first time since the 6th century. That is, previous to Vittorio Emanuele's ascent to the throne in Italy, there had been the states of Venice and Rome and Napoli and Arezzo, but he actually put it together. If I were to ask the same question to somebody from Spain, they would tell me that they're Spanish. But the Basques were busy blowing things up for the longest period of time. The same thing with the Catalonians who wanted to separate, the Galicians and so on. And if I were to ask the British, well, what are you? Are you British? Are you from the United Kingdom? Well, the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. And Great Britain consists of Wales, Scotland, and England. And the Welsh speak their own language. In fact, in order to learn in a university in Wales, you need to speak Welsh. The Scots are interested in separatism, and the Irish situation everybody knows about. However, if I were to ask the same question to a Muslim, a religious Muslim, and especially a jihadist, there would be no concept of city-state. There would be no concept of national state. In fact, the whole concept of a nation-state is a very Western concept. And the result of that is that Europe in particular, and as far as the Far East actually, was once under the control of a Muslim caliphate. So there are a lot of people who think, well, why are Spaniards, why did the situation of the train in Madrid get blown up with 181 dead? Why did 7/7 happen in London? Why did the World Trade Center come down? What does that have to do with the Middle East? The answer is absolutely nothing. What it has something to do with is the fact that the jihadists are not interested in Israel. Iran is not interested in Israel. They have their proxies.
Please.
I'm sorry? I'll continue. I thought there was a question that just came up. The Iranians have their proxies who can handle the likes of us, but their investment is largely in nuclear weapons and in intercontinental ballistic missiles, and they have an eye on Europe. There is a reason that France has a 14.5% Muslim population and a 6.5% Muslim population in the United Kingdom. There's a reason that the British frigates are in our waters, and yet Britain and France abstained in the United Nations this past week in an attempt to support us in our fight against Hamas. Well, that brings us actually to the first issue at hand. There was this fellow named Adolf Hitler who wrote in a book called Mein Kampf the following: how fortunate for leaders that men do not think. And that is one of the issues that's going to be able to hopefully be the glue for us to this evening to be able to put these various concepts together, using the tools of the neurosciences to understand why it is that people are so willing to kill themselves for this idea of a caliphate. Let's see what we can do with this particular concept. In order for us to start this idea of gelling these various and seemingly non-related concepts together in a historical context, we should probably say that the proportion of deaths from terrorism in Israel in the year 2017 was 0.0000137. That's not very much. And the proportion of deaths from traffic accidents in Israel in 2017 was 0.0114. That's a significant difference. In other words, something in the order of about 1 death a day from traffic accidents, as compared to almost imperceptible deaths and even injuries from terrorism, should indicate that traffic problems are more important than terrorism. The answer is quite the contrary, and there's a reason for it. The essential reason for it has something to do with the concept of uncertainty, which we will get to in a moment. So we need a couple of principles in order for us to discuss what it is that we're talking about, one of which is one of the very, very few laws in the behavioral sciences, and it's called the Yerkes-Dodson law. The Yerkes-Dodson law indicates that if your stress level is too low, you won't be functioning at adequate levels. By the same token, if your stress level is overly high, you also won't be functioning at optimum level. But if your stress level is in the middle, then you will, in fact, be functioning at an optimum level. So arousal increases performance up to a point. And when we are highly stressed, we don't perform well. And when we're under stressed, we don't perform well either. Which brings us to one of the principles in the brain. And I promise you, I won't get into the issue of brain sciences in any significant depth, but we need a certain principle a couple of principles before we begin. Another one of the principles besides the Yerkes-Dodson law is the notion of certainty versus uncertainty. We're a whole lot more comfortable when we're certain of things that are going to happen, when there's a greater likelihood of our knowing that there is a likelihood of something to happen. And we become a whole lot more stressed, according to the principles that I just indicated, the Yerkes-Dodson law, when we are uncertain. In fact, here we can see that in these various areas of the brain, like what's called the frontal gyrus, the superior frontal gyrus, we can see the activity level here involves both sides of the brain. Whereas when we're certain, it involves only a small piece of the brain. What that means, and here we can see the same thing, certainty versus uncertainty. The red areas here indicates that more areas of the brain are active. What does this mean? It means that when we use more brain, we're more stressed. By stress, I mean that it takes more sugar, more energy for us to process information when we're uncertain about things as compared to when we are certain about things. And that is the basis of terrorism. One, the likelihood of a terrorist act affecting us is slim to nil. Getting run over by a car is significant, yet we don't have a problem with it. Getting into a car, the statistical likelihood, greater likelihood of our getting hurt. Well, let's take a look at what we've seen since the 1980s globally in terms of Islamic terrorism. I'm taking this from a very bad source. I always tell my students never use Wikipedia, but this will allow us to look at it in a reasonable way. These are world incidents of terrorism. And the line, and as you can see, line by line, it goes on and on and on. And it's not just here in the Middle East. In fact, if we take a look at 2016, India, Iraq, Libya, France, Egypt, France, Iraq, Turkey, Indonesia, Somalia, Burkina Faso, Pakistan, and so on and so forth and so on. This is what's going on. This is 1 year, 2017, Turkey, Iraq, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Egypt, United Kingdom, France, Iran.
Slicha, we're not seeing the data.
You can't see it? Oh, in which case, one moment. Let me get out of this for a moment. And I'll put it on like that. Can you see it now?
Ken, toda raba, thank you.
And Badma. So these are terrorist incidents around the world since about 2006. And you can check it yourself in Wikipedia without our going through these in details. It involves the entire world. So we're not really talking here about the Middle East. We're actually talking about something global, and we'll get to that point in a moment. Proceeding, we can talk about terrorist incidents in the United States. Why do I single out the United States? There is a tendency for the US media to not connect the dots. And the reason they don't do that, I believe, and I don't know this for a fact, is because it's not happening here, it's somewhere else. It's France or it's England, but not here. Well, quite frankly, that's not the case. In fact, I will stop share and show you again examples of terrorism, terrorist acts in the United States by date. And I can go on and on and on and on and on. And we're in 2013, bombings, shootouts, bioterrorism, shootings, and by the way, this is not local terrorism. This is terrorism, global Islamic terrorism. So let me get back to what we were talking about previously. I guess we've made the point. So moving right along. A quick review of Islamic terrorism post 9/11, according to the RAND Corporation's Bruce Hoffman and confirmed by the CIA, is that in 1980, 2 out of 64 groups that were categorized as mostly religiously motivated, not necessarily related to Islam. By 1995, 26 of the 56 groups that were classified as terrorists were Islamic as their guiding force. And in 2023, right now in the United States, 58 out of 65 identified groups classified Islam as their guiding force. So what's beginning to develop as part of our thesis, our argument right now is, we're dealing with Islamic terrorism, jihadism of a particular kind. By the way, there are 1.9 billion Muslims in the world, of whom 20% support jihad to establish Sharia law globally, not here and not in Arabic countries, globally. By the way, 20% of 1.9 billion is 380 million. The United States has 1.5% of its population Muslim, 20% of whom support jihad and terrorism in order to establish Sharia in the United States. Britain has 6.8% Muslim population, 20% of whom the same. France has 14.5% population, and they too, 20% of them desire Sharia to be the law of the land. This information is confirmable through the CIA website. Take a look at it yourselves. Let's move ahead with our argument. So what's the root cause of Muslim terrorism as extremist ideology? And for us to make these particular points, it's going to take us back to the issue of brain sciences, and we'll have a look at that before we conclude. So the root cause of Muslim terrorism is extremist ideology, and it includes the following principles. This is not all Muslims. This is jihadis, and it's 20% of the Muslim population. Only, according to them, and by the way, Hamas and the Muslim Brotherhood and the 58 out of the 62 terrorist organizations, from Boko Haram to the Muslim Brotherhood to Hamas to ISIS, Daesh, all subscribe to the same philosophy. And we'll talk about where it comes from in a moment. The claim is that only Muslims have the right to rule. Non-Muslims are meant to be subjugated. We, Jews, have no right to rule anything. Only Muslims can, according to this philosophy. 2, modern nation states are un-Islamic and constitute a kufr, which is disbelief. So modern nation states like Iraq, Israel, Jordan, Saudi Arabia need to be removed. The only truly Islamic form of state is a unified Muslim caliphate. And when Muslims obtain power, they will overthrow non-Muslim government and rule. And the punishment for a kufr, which is disbelief, is irtidad, which is apostasy, and that is punishable by death, and it must be implemented. And now we're beginning to develop a fundamental religious philosophy that's playing out politically, and this is the basis of political Islam. Political Islam was in part developed by a person named Said Qutb, who wrote a manifesto called Milestone, and it's the basis of Salafi jihadism, or the modern Islamic jihadi movement. And this is basically what he preached. By the way, Qutbism is the driving philosophy of Hamas. Point one, there's an absolute necessity for the enforcement of Sharia. There's a need for violent jihad to bring back Sharia and spread Islam. There's offensive jihad, which is attacking non-Muslim territory, and that ought not to be neglected, and is the work of those who've been defeated by the attacks of the treacherous Orientalists, the Westerners. His other point is Muslims should not let the lack of non-Muslim aggression stop them from waging jihad to spread Sharia law because, quote, truth and falsehood cannot coexist on earth in peace. We, Jews, are false, Christians are false, Muslims, not all Muslims, only Muslims who are Sunni Muslims subscribing to Sharia law are legitimate. Qutbism also includes a loathing of the West. His quote was, "It's a rubbish heap, filth, hollow and worthless, which deliberately undermines Islam, pursuing a well-thought-out scheme to demolish the structure of Muslim society." He also stated, despite the fact that it knows it's inferior to Islam, when confronted with the logic, beauty, and humanity and happiness of Islam, American people blush, he wrote. And lastly, a loathing and hatred of Jews. He stated, world Jewry, whose purpose is to eliminate limitations imposed by faith and religion, so Jews may penetrate into politics of the whole world and to be free to perpetuate their evil designs, such as usury, the aim of which is that all wealth of mankind ends up in the hands of Jewish financial institutions. That's the base philosophy. Now, the Muslim Brotherhood accepted and adopted Qutbism, and the Muslim Brotherhood in Palestine embraced the same ideology as the society across the Arab world, and there are problems with it. A special place is given to Hassan al-Banna and Said Qutb. Hassan al-Banna was known for moderation. Qutb embodied the concept of active opposition to and non-cooperation with existing orders. Izz al-Din al-Qassam was killed by the British in 1935, and the events leading up to the Great Palestinian Rebellion between 36 and 39, the military branch of Hamas today bears his name. It's not from, the Qassam Brigade is after Izz al-Din al-Qassam. So let's take a look at the history, the modern history, and then we'll get into brain sciences and see if we can put all of this together. Between 1968 and 1979, after the Six-Day War, and we'll talk about why that's a significant marking point. From the creation of Israel, there was a Marxist and anti-Western movement throughout the Arab and Islamic world, non-religious. It's important to bear in mind that the Marxist anti-Western movements throughout the Arab and Islamic world were non-religious. And that's why the 72 Lod massacre, for example, was carried out by the Red Brigade from Japan, and the Meinhof gang were Marxist, anti-Western, and that's how Palestinian terrorism started. It was non-religious terrorism. So terrorism, they discovered, was effective in reaching political goals, and it was borrowed from revolutionary movements in Latin America, North Africa, and other places in the world. And typically, it was rural-based urban terrorism. And the Palestinians took advantage of modern communication and transportation systems to internationalize it, and were in fact trained in Latin and South America. It's one of the reasons that Che Guevara from Argentina, who wound up in Cuba, wound up with the Cuban Revolution, and how he wound up in Angola. What happened between 68 and 79 were hijackings, kidnappings, bombings, shootings, ending in kidnappings and subsequent deaths of the athletes, of course, as you remember, during the 72 Munich Olympics. Palestinian groups became models for secular terrorists. They offered lessons for each other. They offered lessons to the IRA in England, for example. And by the end of the 1970s, Palestinian secular network was a major source of terrorist techniques worldwide. That takes us through the 1970s. So the secular Palestinians dominated during the 70s, but religious movements also grew. And Arab nationalism's failure, remember Nasser tried to create the Arab League in between the time that the British left Egypt to the 67 war. So Arab nationalism's failure in 67 resulted in the strengthening of progressive and extremist Islamic movements, religious movements, not non-religious movements. Islamic movements in opposition then with secular nationalism provided an alternative source of welfare education, and the key example to that is the Muslim Brotherhood. So Islamic groups supported by anti-nationalist conservative regimes like Saudi Arabia and the attempted to counter the expansion of nationalist ideology that was non-religious. That was the founding of political Islam, and it was more open to progressive change, was seen as a threat to conservative Arab regimes. So support for more extremist groups occurred in order to combat nationalist and political Islamic movements. So far, it's all rational. There's no non-rationality in here. And 79, of course, was the Islamic Revolution, and we know about that. The next thing that happened was the Cold War. The Cold War, any kind of war, cold or otherwise, pushes technology. So that led to the development of advanced weapons, and it assisted global terrorism. Then we had the problems with the Balkans and Afghanistan and Colombia and Somalia, and that offered areas for terrorist training. Excuse me. We had smuggling and drug smuggling by terrorists in support of global terrorist operations. And there was a willingness of states like Iran and Iraq to provide support for dehumanizing ideologies enabling mass casualty attacks. Afghanistan is a perfect example of that. Pakistan today assists terrorists in Afghanistan and Kashmir. In fact, the Mumbai bombings, shootings not long ago, were likely supported by the Pakistani intelligence service. And since 1994, Pakistani-supported Taliban in Afghanistan assumed characteristics usually associated with state sponsors of terrorism. They provided logistical support, travel documentation, and training facilities. And since '89, there was a willingness of religious extremists to target outside of their immediate countries. That's the background. That's the political background, the philosophical background. And now a word about brain sciences. And after that, we will try to put all of this together. Many of you have heard something about brain organization. And there's some thought that the frontal lobes have something to do with planning and judgment and control of emotion. And the temporal lobes have something to do with speech and language and hearing and so on. Well, it doesn't quite work that way. In fact, what we have at birth is a paucity of connections between cells. At 1 month, there's greater connectivity between cells. 3 months and 15 months, we see a progressive increase in the articulation between various neurons in the brain. In fact, if we were to take a look at this across a lifetime, we'd see an infant. I have a new grandson, that's probably what his brain looks like. At age 1, an infant age 1, compared to a child age 7, there are greater connectivities. And then in adulthood or late adulthood, it tends to pare down even more, which means that our behavior tends to become more automatic as opposed to developing new connectivities. In other words, whatever we needed to learn, we've already learned. So it's during the, let's call it the first 30 years of life, that people are most easily influenced. And it's after the age of about 30 that people are less easily influenced. Which brings us to the next notion, and that's called functional connectivity. So instead of having the brain work in the way that we just described it, here we have various brain regions that interconnect with each other, and they interconnect differentially or differently on the basis of the particular task being involved. So here we have brain networks that are concerned with action, as compared to brain networks that are involved with the identification of visual objects. And here we have leg-related word networks and arm-related word networks, and here face-related words. And what we can do is we can look at these networks as a function of age. So these networks become progressively more complex. They are changeable over time until they ultimately wind up looking in real time like this. These are changeable networks. So people are relatively easily influenced. Our job this evening is to find out how this influence actually happens. Let me just skip ahead. What's underneath all of this is a particular chemical. It's called BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor. If you walk, by the way, you produce more BDNF. If you think, you produce more BDNF. Whatever it is that you're doing that's building these networks in the brain, and that includes what you think, involve BDNF. We have more of it in childhood, and that's why it's easier for us to learn normally. Let's get back to our topic at hand. These are fMRIs, functional magnetic resonance images, of terrorists, normals, and psychopaths. A psychopath, if you take a look at this, I just lost the slide one moment. Let me get back to this. One moment, please. No, I'm not technically challenged. My computer is. Here we go. Here we can see a normal individual. This is the normal individual's frontal lobes. Here's the frontal lobe of an MRI of terrorists. They all look pretty much the same. You can see there's no significant difference. And here's a psychopath. A psychopath is a person who doesn't connect emotionality with thought. And you'd expect that the terrorists, the ones who did whatever it is that they did to us 3 weeks ago, were psychopaths. Absolutely not. They're absolutely normal individuals. And our question is, how in God's good earth can you create a normally functioning individual in terms of that individual's brain to create and to perpetrate the atrocities that were perpetrated, that we all have borne witness to? Here again, this is another view of the same. Here's a normal fMRI of a normal individual. Here's of a terrorist, and here's of a psychopath. And here you can see the significant differences between these cases. So the limbic system of the brain deals with emotionality, and the frontal lobes deal with the connection with that emotionality. A psychopath has those connections between the two missing. So an example of a psychopath would be, I remember that there was actually a sexual thrill. You hear a little pop and pull their heads off and hold their heads up by their hair, whipping their heads off, the body sitting there. That get me off. This is a statement by Edmund Kemper, who's got a life sentence for murdering, dismembering, and engaging in necrophilia with 10 women, including his mother and grandmother. He's sitting in a prison, I think in California. It's kind of what happened to us 3 weeks ago, but these people are normal. So how is this guy not normal and the other ones are? And that's what we need to find out. So we're going to call terrorism of the kind that we've just seen rational psychopathy. There's no frontal lobe difference as we've just seen. So what is it? So now I'm going to give you a couple of demonstrations, and then we get to discuss what's going on. This is a groupthink on the topic of social conformity. And let me put the video on.
To answer that question, we set up a hidden camera experiment to see if this woman would stand up at the sound of this tone, simply because everyone else is. You might be thinking you'd never go along with this. Or would you? After just 3 beats, and without knowing why she's doing it, this woman is now conforming perfectly to the group. But what happens if we take the group away?
Elaine, please.
Okay, now she's alone. The crowd is gone and nobody is watching her except our hidden cameras. What do you think she'll do? She's now conforming to the rules of the group without them even being there. Now, watch what happens when we introduce another outsider who doesn't know the rules.
Have a seat and they'll be out in just a couple minutes. Thanks so much. Everybody was doing it, so I thought I was supposed to.
Think she'll teach the new guy what to do? We kept the cameras rolling as more unsuspecting patients arrived. And slowly but surely, what began as a random rule for this woman has now become the social norm for everyone in this waiting room. Here to explain what's going on in their brains is Jonah Berger of the University of Pennsylvania.
This sort of internalized form of herd behavior is part of what we call social learning. Starting at a very early age, when we see members of our group perform a task, our brains literally reward us for following in their footsteps.
When I saw everybody stand up, I felt like I needed to join them. Otherwise, I'm like excluded. Once I decided to go with it, then I felt much more comfortable.
Conformity is how we become socialized, but it can also cause us to develop bad habits or repeat past wrongs.
And it's why even this rebel, who wasn't standing for any of this nonsense, eventually joined the ranks. And the only thing more shocking than seeing how easily conformity affects the way you act is that similar forces are subconsciously shaping the way you think right now.
That then brings us to the need to discuss what just happened. The need for social conformity is built into the nervous system. And the reason it is because it takes us roughly 20 years in order for us to develop a child. We're the only organisms that take this long in order to train our children to become independent. Independence is roughly a 25-year process. It used to be, we used to get to independence, the so-called age of majority, significantly earlier, roughly at about the age of 15. In fact, in the United Kingdom, in my father's generation, there was the 11 plus, and at 15 you could leave school. Today it's a bit different, but not by much. That's why social conformity trained in early childhood is as powerful as it is. And that is exactly what Hamas is doing. That's what Hasidim are doing too. In fact, that's what we do. It's called raising children. Usually, I'd like to think we do that with a positive outlook of what we are trying to establish, what the kinds of lives we want to establish for our children. I am sure that the school system in the Palestinian Authority, I'm sure that the Los Angeles school district that's now doing critical race theory has the same idea in mind. Unfortunately, it's going to be at somebody's expense when you do that kind of thing. So let me show one other experiment, which goes back roughly about 70 years or so, which I think will make the point, and then I'll take questions. So let me put this on. This is a gentleman named Ash who did the following experiment. Some of you may know this, but it's it's interesting to look at how this plays out as well.
But an experiment is not a public opinion poll. It examines behavior under the pressure of social forces, as the experiment of Solomon Asch reveals.
The experiment you'll be taking part in today involves the perception of lengths of lines. As you can see here, I have a number of cards, and on each card there are several lines. Your task is a very simple one. You're to look at the line on the left and determine which of the 3 lines on the right is equal to it in length. All right, we'll proceed in this order. You'll give your answer.
Only one of the people in the group is the real subject, the 5th person with the white t-shirt. The others are confederates of the experimenter and have been told to give wrong answers on some of the trials. The experiment begins uneventfully as subjects give their judgments.
2, 2, 2, 2,
2, 3,
3,
3,
3,
But on the 3rd trial, something happens.
2,
2,
2,
2,
2.
The subject denies the evidence of his own eyes and yields to group influence.
1,
Asch found subjects went along with the group on 37% of the critical trials. But he found through interviews that they went along with the group for different reasons.
1.
1,
They must be right. There are 4 of them and 1 of me.
1.
This subject's yielding is based on a distortion of his judgment. He genuinely believes that the group is correct.
1, 1,
1,
2, 1, 2, 2, 2,
I know they're wrong, but why could I make waves?
2,
In this case, the subject knows he is right, but goes along to avoid the discomfort of disagreeing with the group. Here, the distortion is at the level of his response.
2,
2, 2, 2,
In the previous experiment, the naive subject stood alone against the group. In this variation, Asch gave the naive subject a partner, here seated in the 3rd position, who also gives the correct response.
1,
1, 2, 1,
2,
With a partner, yielding drops to only 5% of the critical trials compared to 37% without a partner.
Okay, we get the point. So that having been said, I think I've basically outlined, let me see if I can review what it is that we did. We indicated that there is a long history of Islamic rule over much of the globe, that we're not talking about Hamas versus ourselves, we're talking about global terrorism, not terrorism, global Islamic terrorism, which is fueled by jihadist philosophy. It has a lot to do with the early training in early childhood and group dynamics that go with it. And this is a lot of what we're seeing in the streets of New York, the streets of London. And clearly it's not about us, because the motivating factor for Hamas, and please do read their charter, is not the destruction of the state of Israel. It is the destruction of the state of Israel and the fomenting of global jihad to establish Sharia law globally. With that, I've concluded my remarks, and I'll throw it open to questions. I know there are some questions in chat. There's one question. The last one, I'll do it backwards. Are these experiments in social conformity applicable to the Nazi claims that they were not individually responsible for their actions? We got 2 things on the table here. One is the effect of group dynamics on individual performance. But at the end of the day, each of us as human beings are individually responsible for our own actions. So if I were to claim that my group told me to murder, kill, rape somebody, the group doesn't go on trial, I go on trial. So at the end of the day, the reason that we raise children the way we do is to create them as individuals. And their individuality is based on the capacity of their nervous system to act in an integrated fashion. We can interfere with that either through the use of pharmaceuticals or by trauma or by surgical manipulation like lobotomies and lobotomies. But at the end of the day, we're each of us responsible for our own actions. So there is, in the same way that there's no collective guilt, there is individual responsibility. It's another question. Are these experiments of social conformity? I had read that the Hamas terrorists were given Captagon to push them to act even more violently. Is that correct? The answer is yeah, it's correct. By the way, the Arabic word, we used in English, actually, English word, assassin, comes from the Arabic hashish, which is, well, you all know what hashish is, hash. And that was used by assassins way back when they were ordered to murder someone. Can you please provide more details about the future of secular Palestinian domination during the 1970s to give us a sense of the conditions that bred the extreme Islam religious movement? Yeah. As I understand it, the Saudis, the Ibn Saud family, and the Hashemites, both in Iraq and, well, no longer in Iraq, but in Jordan. Well, let's leave Jordan out of it at the time being. It's a little more complex. But the Saudis certainly were worried that the Arab nationalist movements were trying to unseat the kingdom of Saudi Arabia and replace it with a non-religious Arab-based state. So they started investing in religious jihadi type movements, not against us, but as a counter to Arab nationalism. So the failure of secular Palestinian domination during the 1970s is largely a function of money. That is, the money from the oil-producing countries created the development of schools of Islamic thought, Islamic universities, and actually wound up ultimately sponsoring terrorism. Are the Black Muslims in the US as supportive of terrorism and jihad as other Muslims? Some people consider the so-called Black Muslims, the Nation of Islam in the United States, as not to be traditional Muslims. I don't want to go down that rabbit hole. But suffice it to say that there are different branches of Islam, one of which, of course, are the Sunni, that are found in Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, not in Syria. Syria, there are the Alawites who are Shia. The Shia and the Sunni don't get along at all. That's why sometimes we see or hear of mosques getting blown up by the Mehdi army in Iraq or in Pakistan. And the reason for that is, the Shia who are found in Iran are largely seen as reformers of one sort or another, even though they are as traditional as they are. There's yet another branch of Islam called the Ahmadis, and they're not even considered by the Pakistani government as Muslim. In fact, they're apostates. And that's why there have been mosques that have been blown up in Pakistan of late. However, the Black Muslims in the United States are certainly supportive of jihad, of Sharia. And if you remember the story of Malcolm X, he was taken out by his own people, not by others. So the answer is yes and no. It depends. Their basic idea is not to blow up the world. It's to separate themselves from the United States, whom they consider to be, the leadership of which are considered to be Satan incarnate. Are there any other questions? It's another one that came up. Is the neurological processes associated with radical Islam reversible? The answer is, can you unlearn something? It's actually a great question. We have a couple of processes. Psychologists actually have studied this a lot. It's called retroactive and proactive inhibition. That is, if I learn French, I don't speak French. If I learn French and I have some command of it, but not fluent, and then I learn Spanish, if my Spanish interferes with my French, that would be called retroactive inhibition. If my French interferes with my ability to learn Spanish, that would be called proactive inhibition. If I were to extrapolate that larger and say, can you unlearn something that you've learned? The answer is it's really hard to do something like that. So one of the big mistakes, I think, that the United States made in dealing with riots from the 1960s onwards, is that many of the problems of the Black communities in the United States were, they attempted to ameliorate these problems by creating things like open enrollment, affirmative action, and so on and so forth. What happens if you have a poorly trained student coming into university at the age of 18? You can't reasonably expect that young person, that young man or woman, to be able to function adequately in an intellectual environment of the kind that usually is found in universities. So they had, at the time, in the 1960s and 70s, in fact, even until today, compensatory education that hopefully was able to bring the standard up. It didn't. We here in Israel have had a great deal of success in dealing with our immigrants, our olim, that have come from Ethiopia, from parts of India, and so on. And the basic idea is there's not much you can do with the parents. Let it go. I'll get to the point. Give me the kids. And that's essentially the same problem that we've got with the present generation, with Hamas and the Palestinian Authority in particular, which is that these kids have been inculcated, and now they're adults, with anti-Semitism, with hate, and you can't get rid of hate. In fact, it's so difficult that I remember when I was an undergraduate, about 60 years ago, actually, I remember having taken a psychology course, a social psychology course, and we had seen a video, and in that video, there was a professor who had asked students at Duke University the earliest experiences they could remember of racial discrimination from home. How do they learn it? And one young lady who really impacted on me greatly said the following in this movie. She was about 4 or 5 years old at the time. Her mother was she and her mom were in the kitchen, and the doorbell rang, and mom said, please go to answer the door and see who it is. Young lady went to the door. There was a Black woman at the front door who said, I'd like to speak to your mom. And the young lady went back into the kitchen, told her mom, there's a woman, there's a lady at the front door. Mom went to the front door, contracted whatever business she needed to, came back into the kitchen, said nothing other than, my dear, that was not a lady, that was a Negro woman. How do you get rid of those kind of networks that I on a superficial way, indicated how they're built? If you guys remember, BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor, the substance that's underneath neuroplasticity and how we build networks. How do you get rid of that? It's already built. So the answer to that question is you need to get the next generation of kids. Not much you can do with what we got right now. How can Muslims have both jihadi ideas and the opposite, compassion? The answer is 20% of Muslims support jihadism. The rest don't. I'm sorry, 20% do support it and are active with it. Many others are kind of okay about it, but all right, well, we're living in another country, and I'd say roughly half don't support it and are actually normal human beings. So that needs to be taken into consideration as well. Is the radical Islam a majority among Islam? No, it's 20%. Is the neurological process of radical Islam reversible? No, just stop teaching hate. And I think the last question that we'll take, have we run out of time or we still have time?
We have a few more minutes.
Okay. I've read an excellent book some time ago on the psychology behind mass murders, satirically called Heroes. Cannot recall the author. One of the chapters details how the Islamic extremism stems from the cognitive dissonance of a greater past and a failed present. The Arab world used to be the cradle of culture of science, such as the roots of modern math and other disciplines, while currently they don't contribute too much to the modern science and are generally seen as retrograde. What are your thoughts? 1066, Richard the Lionhearted went on a crusade. Richard was an Arabist. Richard highly valued the Arabic scholarship. Yes, this is all true. Arabic scholarship was global. It was important. Great discoveries. Algebra, for example, is an Arabic word, algebra, and many, many other things like that. Unfortunately, what happened was the 7th century. The 7th century, Muhammad was out to conquer the world, and that's exactly what he did. And with the conquest of other parts of the world and the conversion to Islam of many, many, it actually killed Arabic scholarship. Universities like the one in Mali closed down. They don't exist anymore. In fact, it's covered by desert. But these were houses of great scholarship. So the answer is, yeah, once upon a time it was like that. I quite frankly think that the West is heading in the same direction. We now work in sound bites. And if anyone who actually reads or attempts to read a newspaper or listens to the news, we find that in 22 minutes, you actually have the entire situation of the world repeated again and again and again. And there's really little substance to it other than political hype. We also grunt. We also are using icons instead of language. Where that goes in terms of the development of the human race, I have no idea, but I don't think it's good. How does jihadism connect with the opposite features like hospitality and concern for other people? Oh, jihadism connects with hospitality and concern for people who are Muslim. Not Muslim, who are followers of Jihadi Islam. Everyone else, as we had indicated before from Qutbism, is irrelevant and they need to be killed. And I think we've covered. Would love to have the link to the recording of the. What we can do, actually, let me turn it over and we'll talk about how we can get. I have no problem giving the recording over at all. So how do we do that?
We'll do it. We'll do it tomorrow.
Okay. In which case, I'd like to thank all of you guys for having turned up and for giving me the opportunity to look and share my thoughts on how we got to the situation that we're in. And my final thought on the subject is, do bear in mind that we, Be'ezrat Hashem, will solve our particular problem, but our particular problem is not the problem. Because what you're seeing now is being globalized. And the alliance between the left, communist, socialist, and radical Islam is not a natural mix. But because the narrative has been changed to a colonial or a post-colonial narrative, it has traction in leftist circles. The leftists are being used as useful idiots, I believe, and think. And I think we haven't even begun to scratch the surface of how this is going to parlay globally. And it's going to happen. And I don't want to leave on a negative note, but I think we have textbooks on their merry way over the next 100 years, being able to look back on the beginning of World War III. Thank you for the invitation.
Thank you very much. Anyone has just one last question before we close? I don't see any. So we'll close with that and we'll send you the recording tomorrow. Thank you very, very much. Good night.
Well, let me just say thank you again, and we will handle this somehow or another, but we all do need to get together and find a way to deal with a global problem, and hopefully we'll be able to do that one day through the United Nations. Hopefully. Be well. Take care.